I wrote a book called Heads, a biography of psychedelic America. I started writing it about 5 years ago, right around the time that a lot of this research started coming out in the news and a lot of these papers started getting published. Growing up in the United States in the 1980s, psychedelics were sort of normalized. Going to college in the 1990s, psychedelics were just this ever-present part of the culture. It's hard to say they were exactly normalized, but there was certainly a framework for doing them and sort of accepted ways of doing them. And it got me thinking about the long arc of psychedelics in this country. I really wanted to pinpoint the moment that psychedelics, I guess sort of the one sort of crude way to put it would be hit the streets. Sort of escaped from traditional use, escaped from early experimental use, escaped from early therapeutic use. And on my way over here, I realized that we are literally a block from the earliest place I was able to pinpoint that happening, which is a place called the $$ Cafe. It was on East 6th Street, just east of 2nd Avenue, and they sold peyote over the counter in the late 1950s. They ordered it mail order from Texas and repackaged it. And that's the moment that I kind of traced back to the beginning of this sort of alternate history of psychedelics that I'm really fascinated by. The one that's, uncontrolled and sort of unchecked and is sort of far away from the science, but also kind of provides sort of a starting place. I was also sort of taking stock of what was, what is now the present moment and what is really like these last 10 years or so, which from the historical point of view of what I was looking at for Heads is really, really remarkable in how much has changed over the last 10 years. At the beginning of the 21st century, there were a bunch of factors that I'll talk about in a little bit that sort of led to this blank slate sort of for the way psychedelics are perceived in this country. And there's a great continuity between everything that happened in sort of the 40 or 50 years before that and the 10 years, these past 10 years. But these past 10 years have seen, sort of all these this explosion of research, this explosion of pilot programs and new certifications. But the way psychedelics in this country are done sort of outside of that have also changed really, really radically. The way that they're made available and the variety of them, the demographics of people using them, the way that people are using them, the places that people are doing them, the dangers associated with them, and the economics behind them. All of these things have kind of turned over in really interrelated ways over the last decade. Even the vocabulary used to describe psychedelics has changed them. The word psychedelic is really not preferred by a lot of contemporary users. A lot of people now just simply refer to them as medicine or medicines, sacraments. There's all kinds of more polite words than psychedelics, and I think the deeper reason why I'm interested in all of this is because I really believe that psychedelic history matters. There's something just so important about understanding the way all of these things fit together. If we acknowledge that psychedelics have acted as a catalyst for this huge kind of dual creative and spiritual awakening in this country over the last half century, where you see them having this enormous impact in all kinds of the fields of arts and science and technology, and also sort of, as I was saying, this this massive spiritual awakening that's happened, where I guess there's that famous or infamous tricycle survey from 1996 where it talks about how over 80% of the people responding to this survey who had found their way to Buddhism through psychedelics. So there are all these things that feed into this huge arc. And hanging over the whole huge story of this is the fact that it's illegal. And there's criminality hanging over every single aspect of this story that makes it really complicated to talk about. It just requires a lot of nuance and thinking through to sort of get into these little bits. And kind of the closer you get to psychedelic history, sort of the blurrier it gets. And that's probably true of any field of history. The closer you get to sort of primary sources and what happened, things get, things aren't always exactly as they've been presented. And I think that's very, very true with psychedelics. But because of the importance of the story and the way that criminality ties it all together, it makes it even more important. to think about the way psychedelic science has evolved over the last 10 years and over the decades before that, with all of these regulations hanging over the heads of anybody who is interested in doing it. And I think that's inseparable from talking about the history of the science and talking about the history of the culture, is that you have all of these secrets, basically. You have all these things that you can't talk about. And I think we're now getting to the point where you can really start unpacking those things and looking at them and investigating them. Neil brought up to me recently, David Nichols has a theory that, the traditional Albert Hoffman story of how LSD was discovered is maybe not exactly how he recounted it all these years. And you go back and you find all these moments in psychedelic history, and there's always that little bit of blur where you're looking into the government's research programs in the 50s and the explosion of the counterculture, and there are all these counter narratives about where it came from and who was responsible for what. And it's fascinating to start picking through them. And it kind of leads us up to this present moment. And I guess kind of what I'm getting at is that there will always be an alternate history of psychedelics, because there is no definitive history of psychedelics, because of this blurriness, because of the huge spiritual impact they have, and these mysterious things that psychedelics still cause in people that I'm looking forward to finding out a lot more about over the next few days. So the place that I kind of want to start today in thinking about the last 10 years of psychedelics is really to point out that a couple of things. First, that, this is maybe an obvious point to make, but I'll make it, which is that the vast majority of psychedelic users in this country have always been, and for the foreseeable future will continue to be, outside the realm of formal study and outside the realm of formal therapy. And we're getting well into the millions of Americans here who've, tens of millions perhaps, who've experimented with psychedelics over the last half century. A recent survey, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, estimates 1.2 million current users of what they still kind of crudely call hallucinogens. And the other thing to realize about that is that this is actually an all-time low. And that's kind of, that's sort of shocking to me, given the range of activity that's been going on over the last decade in terms of research, in terms of, sort of events that Burning Man has spawned, in terms of, the dance culture, in terms of music culture. According to the Monitoring the Future report, which is one of the sort of the standard metrics of psychedelic use in this country, LSD is down to 2.4% of respondents between the ages of 19 and 30. Which is down from a high of around the turn of the century. And it doesn't really measure the specific substances. It doesn't really measure usage. It's just sort of a very blunt instrument to do this. Psychedelics haven't disappeared at all, but their presence in this country as a sort of this kind of radical fringe thing that you do in your 20s and 30s is starting to shift. And I'd argue, and I'd be interested in sort of discussing if there, what metrics you can use to get at this. I'd be interested in discussing sort of maybe how the age use has changed in psychedelics. One thing that came up continuously in studies in the 80s and 90s is how male the psychedelic world skewed. There are some surveys I've seen that indicated, maybe up to 2/3 or 75% of people involved were male. And I think that's probably started to change over the last decade as well. One of the sort of the many things that have turned over. And as Neil was saying, and as lots of people were saying, one of the huge changes over the last 10 years is kind of this arrival of ayahuasca in North America. And I think with that comes kind of an even deeper shift in the way psychedelics are being used and the way psychedelics are being done. And it's sort of a shift back to kind of the session model of psychedelics, maybe what they would have called in the 60s the guru model of having, sort of an organized group experience around this. And that's really interesting to me because LSD was the dominant psychedelic in this country for so long until sort of this this petering off around 1999, 2000, and sort of other psychedelics came in to replace it. But the thing that's to me really important about LSD and why it remains kind of a cornerstone in understanding psychedelics in this country is because it's this non-dogmatic psychedelic experience in the way that ayahuasca and peyote and mushrooms all kind of come with hundreds, thousands of years of tradition behind them and you know, sort of a framework. LSD arrived in this country in the 40s and 50s and 60s without any of that. It was, you know, Albert Hoffman discovered it in the 40s, Sandoz put it out into the world, but put it out in this really open-ended, kind of open-minded way of what can you do, what can you discover with this, what can be done. And the story of the last 50 years is what people have discovered for that, both legally and illegally, mostly illegally. These different frameworks that have emerged in I guess what you would call underground use or kind of uncontrolled use of psychedelics that kind of grew out of these, you know, kind of cliche 60s, 70s, you know, kind of orange sunshine moments, but kind of became this real sturdy thing that by the time I grew up in the 90s was a tradition that you passed into, even if that acted really like folklore in the sense that it was being passed down from the people before you. And you could read about it in books. You could pull out, you know, Tom Wolfe from the library, or, you know, I grabbed Aldous Huxley off my dad's bookshelf, or all these, you know, different ways of doing it. And you eventually sort of find your way to a framework, whether that's a group experience or whether that's meditation, or you know, finding your way in through Timothy Leary and Baba Ram Dass. There are all these different paths, and I think that makes LSD a distinctly American psychedelic, or sort of Euro-American, in that it's contemporary. The tools that emerged around that are continuing to change and are still really valid. These kind of things that acted like memes in the 50s and the 60s, you know, the notion of set and setting, really circulated as sort of these little folkloric slogans. One huge obvious change is just the availability of information, this sort of informational structures around acid. Sites like Arrowhead were established in the mid-90s, but really kind of hit their stride, I think, with the arrival of the social media era over the last 10 years, where there's now this amazing knowledge base of safety factors and experiences and what to expect or what not to expect, or you know, at different dosage levels and material like that. And that's led to this self-consciousness, I think, in kind of what you would think of as the psychedelic underground, where, like I was saying, the vocabulary is even changing. People don't trip anymore. They take journeys, you know, things like that. There's, you know, one expression that I'm really fascinated by that I've seen kind of come into the psychedelic world over the last, you know, 5 years, 10 years. I'm not even sure when it kind of slipped in, is this expression of holding space, which I think has kind of come over from sort of, you know, different you know, therapeutic worlds and yoga practices and things like that, and is now, I hear it as kind of a substitute for trip sitting, something like, you know, things like that. And all these different vocabulary words then change the way I think people internalize and think about these substances and these practices, and has a lot to do with the way they're changing in the 21st century. I think a lot of it has to do with maybe even kind of burying this past, burying this kind of crazy past where psychedelics were available on the street and easy to get. Another huge framework from the 60s and 70s that started to evolve now more in the present is kind of this group usage notion of psychedelics. I think that the tendency is often to dismiss them as quote-unquote recreational, which I think is maybe a little bit of a diminutive word to describe it. But over a period of decades, structures formed around these group uses of psychedelics that created these safe spaces for people to use them that I still think are really worth examining and talking about, because they're still valid, and because, you know, this conversation is still continuing onward. You now see in these formal studies the first stages of quantifying a lot of things that were reported anecdotally in the decades before that. Some of the most fascinating studies for me recently is, reading about sort of, creating a pilot study to talk about LSD and ego dissolution, or LSD and, music, or LSD and empathy. All of these things that are really, kind of sort of normal to people who have experienced them now have ways to sort of talk about it in formal ways. And I think a next step is to start talking about these group experiences in a formal ways, and these group frameworks. Another piece of psychedelic history that we're within a couple blocks radius of right now is the invention of disco at the Love Saves the Day party at David Mancuso's loft, which abbreviates very neatly to LSD. And David Mancuso and other DJs, sort of a continuum from then till now, built their DJ sets and planned their nights around the fact that people were going to be there having ecstatic psychedelic experiences. That was how the music was programmed. That was how everything was planned. And a bigger framework, even sort of like that, was the Grateful Dead, who were this traveling psychedelic structure for 30 years in every way. Their performances created a musical framework for the psychedelic experience, where they would have a 4-hour arc with an intermission in the middle that started off as pieces of music that were sort of contained and eventually opened up into sort of this chaotic mode and eventually resolved. And at either side of the Grateful Dead concert, you have this community out in the, the fields or the parking lot or whatever around the Grateful Dead show that allow you sort of this entry point into their psychedelic world, and more significantly and importantly, a reintegration point afterwards, where you have this transition phase and you have this community that you can talk about these experiences with in what was and remains a very, very open way. They had an infrastructure for it where they would have, people there to help people with difficult experiences in real time. There was even a sobriety table at Grateful Dead shows called the Wharf Rats. And it's all what the theorist Hakim Bey called a temporary autonomous zone. And I think the notion of thinking about a temporary autonomous zone as a safe place for psychedelic exploration is very, very useful, especially in sort of this age where, we're now being constantly bombarded with our phones. It's just so hard to escape from the grid. It's such a, kind of cheesy expression to use at this point because it's so prevalent. But finding that space and finding that moment and defining places where you can do these things is still really important. And I think the notions that these dance scenes and the Grateful Dead world espouse through these temporary autonomous zones are really valuable to look at. And you see them manifesting now, in Burning Man, which has been going on for, longer than the Grateful Dead existed at this point. But you also see it in this sort of wealth of spin-offs and places that have emerged outside of that, where people now try to, sort of build these places where that can be done in a respectful way, in a safe way. You have things like the Zendo Project that sort of, act as risk reduction at different festivals around the world. There's really just an emerging sense of how it can be done properly. The world that the Grateful Dead came out of, and the world that the dance music scene came out of, was this vibrant counterculture that I think gets reduced down to drugs and politics frequently, but was really kind of this large-scale economy, that existed with ideas, it existed with drugs, it existed with money, it existed with karma, it existed with all these different currencies that circulated in different ways and had different values. And I think you can continue to trace that economy of ideas, like I was saying, that literal economy, into the present moment. And you see these, the emergence of ayahuasca and the emergence of things like microdosing as growing out of, or at least in the United States, growing out of some of these notions of kind of the wellness movement, which has these sort of firm countercultural roots. I want to sort of really emphasize that it was a literal economic structure, where for a long time in this country, sort of the black market, for lack of a better phrase, sale of these drugs funded all kinds of different things. They funded private research, they funded art, they funded science, they funded technology. One that I was reading recently about was they funded Alice Waters, drug dealers funded Alice Waters' first restaurant, Chez Panisse. So that site, we have psychedelics to owe for some revolutions in tasty food. People talk about that as, sort of this modern notion of a gift economy, which sort of in the same way that calling psychedelics recreational, I think, is kind of an oversimplification of the way that all of these things fit together. And actually, a paper that I was reading recently, it's a chapter in the World Ayahuasca Diaspora book that's, I think, about to come out by, the chapter is by Kenneth Tupper, who's going to speak about the ayahuasca economy. And you read that chapter and it fits in exactly perfectly with all these notions of this economy of ideas and economy of beliefs that has fed the wellness movement and has fed this modern moment. And I think that's a really important way to understand ayahuasca, to understand these exchanges of value that happen between sort of the people who are organizing the ceremonies and people who are participating in them and just participating in them, and the way the ceremonies kind of fit into this broader notion of a continuing counterculture, a continuing culture of higher consciousness, kind of whatever you want to call that. That I think has a great deal to say about the way the perception of psychedelics are being transformed in this country, because this economy of ideas now has this sort of output in terms of the internet, in terms of social media, in terms of people being more and more open about talking about their experiences. And this has been, I think, maybe possibly the most important change over the last decade, is this movement towards coming out of the psychedelic closet, which is a phrase that's been used a bunch, and the emergence of a community around that. In New York, we have this group Symposia. They're doing sort of psychedelic storytelling, and in LA, there's the Aware Project that's really been focusing on integration and talking about ways to take these experiences and fit them in with your life and fit them in with the culture around you, which is something I'm sure we'll be hearing more about over the next few days as well. And all of these things, these feed back into the greater society and feed back into the greater conversation. And I guess my ultimate hope is that there will be more of what you would call an integration between this sort of the underground world of psychedelics and this, the uncontrolled use of psychedelics, and this research world that's emerging. And there are all kinds of places that those two can dialogue and cross over. As a historian and researcher, I've been really just personally fascinated, for example, by the emergence of what are called the digital humanities, kind of, using new tools to analyze old data. And to me, there's nothing more exciting about that than taking that and applying it to, say, like Arrowhead's experience reports over the last 20 years and looking for themes and looking for things that have popped out in terms of drug safety, in terms of what's called psychedelic information theory, all these ways that you can crunch this very informal information in a really useful, positive way. And I think there are all kinds of ways that world can then inform the next phases of research, the next phases of regulation, of decriminalization. It's cheesy to use the phrase mind-blowing, but that's exactly what this is. I have a bit of a hard time envisioning psychedelic decriminalization, though I obviously have great hopes for it, sort of looking at the political dialogue of this country and realizing how much nuance is required to talk about psychedelics and deal with them in a real way, versus how much nuance is sort of available in kind of the current bandwidth of the American public conversation. And I think there's still a large chasm to be bridged there between those two things. But I think events like this, and I think, sort of coming out of the closet psychedelic storytelling nights, I think all of these things are there to help build that bridge. And the notion of normalizing psychedelics is a little, or I guess mainstreaming is kind of a popular noun to verb thing that people use these days, which does have me, it does raise question marks for me in the way that psychedelics have been used for a lot of years in terms of being used as a way to differentiate oneself from the society at large and to sort of break free from cultural preconceptions. They're now reading all these stories about LSD microdosing and as being ways to make you more productive at work, which is, to me, in some ways, kind of the complete opposite of what a lot of these substances had been used for over the last half decade. But it then opens up these questions of like I was saying, integration and how do all these things fit together? How do notions of work change in contemporary society? And how does the notion of psychedelics change relative to that? So I guess, I'm just really excited about all these giant whopping question marks that we have over the next 10 years and the way that all this research is going to develop, but the way the underground is going to continue to develop too. The notion of the Darknet, I think, is really fascinating to me because it grows out of the idea of encryption, which is something that's been an important part of the psychedelic technological counterculture for the last 25 years or so, where you look at groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which are all this group of basically psychedelic Silicon Valley veterans, one of them being Grateful Dead lyricist John Perry Barlow, establishing themselves as sort of the kind of a civil liberties union on the internet. And encryption became this extremely important point and obviously is a huge story in the present day just in terms of the exchange of information. But the idea that you could create this private market using that notion and create this entire little subworld is really fascinating. And Bitcoin, which is the currency that's been used to power it, is likewise sort of an encryption-powered currency where it's theoretically private. And one of the things that fascinates me so much about the Darknet is that, in fact, it was the sales of drugs and the sales of psychedelics, really, that powered the rise of Bitcoin and powered the rise of this alternative currency. And for years, people have talked about creating an alternative culture and, this sort of this separate parallel thing in addition to the mainstream culture, right? That's been one of like the ongoing, that's literally what the notion of the counterculture is. And the Darknet creates a technological infrastructure for that. That's what that is. And then in turn kind of creates this community within it that has sort of, it has risk, there's a risk reduction element to it. There's a group, they were originally called the LSD Avengers. I think they're called the Darknet Market Avengers now, who test substances and rate vendors the same way that they would on Yelp. Like, oh yeah, I got this, this dancing bear blotter and it's 4 out of 5. Recommend, would do it again, that kind of thing. And that's, it's funny in some ways, but I think that's an incredible way that kind of this ad hoc psychedelic marketplace has kind of come in to sort of fill this need. There are no easy ways to sort of, you can't just go into, a corner and drop a substance into a box anonymously or even non-anonymously and find out what's there, what's in it. And so I think there's a lot to watch in terms of that kind of community aspect of the Darknet. The availability of LSD sort of dropped off almost entirely around the turn of the century, around sort of 2000, 2001. Part of that was the end of the Grateful Dead as this touring network in 1995, where you see like one huge steep drop. And then there were kind of this series of high-profile busts. There was a bunch of, some people argue that ecstasy really replaced it. Mushrooms eclipsed LSD in terms of popularity around then too, which I would probably point to, the ease of growing them is probably, increased over that period. But I would probably, the big reason would be just the straight availability of it. There aren't things like the Grateful Dead right now, where you can just go and buy things wholesale. That's another point about the Darknet market, is that it's significantly shifted the way drugs are distributed in this country, and it does act as kind of this wholesale thing in the way that concerts and festivals used to be, but obviously hasn't replaced it to you know, in terms of mass use like that. It used to be that, you know, the Grateful Dead came through Iowa, and you know, drug dealers would go to a Grateful Dead show and buy wholesale amounts, and then the next 2 months, you know, LSD arrests would tick up in Iowa. And that probably really for the better doesn't happen anymore. But it also means that there's this huge drop-off otherwise. To reduce it down to sort of the one notion of the gift, of the idea that somebody is, you know, giving something to somebody without the expect of something in return, but maybe something will be returned later, I think is certainly one aspect of kind of the larger countercultural economy. But I think that like I was saying, sort of the notion of the Darknet fits into that. The notion of, you know, kind of the information economy fits into that as well, where you have all of these different things that can be defined as currencies. And I think to boil that down, I think it's just the notion of gift that probably maybe rubs me the wrong way, because it implies some kind of ownership that I think doesn't really accurately represent kind of what's being exchanged, both in an individual moment, but also in kind of the bigger picture. I don't know if that